Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I'm here with Leonard Silk. Talked to him for the New York Times archives. Leonard is, I think, the country's first and foremost economic journalist. The bare outlines of his career are easy to access. He suddenly went to the University of Wisconsin, graduated in 1940. Had wartime service, which he might tell us about. Got a PhD at Duke in 1947. And if you look at his bio, there's an enormous number of honorary degrees, books, commissions, prizes, awards, etc. In journalism, I think the two most important places were the Business Week magazine before he came here, and then the New York Times, which he joined in 1970 as an editorial writer and also a columnist. You left here last year, 1992, yes. And in between wrote editorials, wrote columns, wrote stories, and generally provided an encouraging atmosphere for those who followed after him, including me. So I guess my first question is what was it like for you in the early days? Well, let me bring you to that question by my own past just a tad. When I first heard about Leonard was in 1961 when I was a senior in college and majored in economics, and I was a journalist, aspiring journalist, and I went to a professor named Vasily Leontiev,
later a Nobel laureate.
Nobel Prize winner. And I said, where do you go in journalism if you want to write economics? And he said, my friend Leonard Silk is at Business Week. Go work with him. And I did eventually apply to Business Week after journalism school, and I didn't know where they'd put me, but lo and behold, they put me with Leonard as a young reporter. And that's how I began. And that was the beginning of the 60s when Leonard was the only one there in the field, and I've always wanted to understand this better. How was that out there all alone?
Well, it was fun even in those days. I went to Business Week in '54, but I had been working in Paris in the U.S. mission to NATO and to what was then the OEEC. But I really started life as a newspaperman, meaning in junior high school, and all that kind of thing. I picked my first All-American football team when I was in the 8th grade. I could tell you the names, only it's not relevant. Jerry Dalrymple was my favorite. He played left end for Tulane.
All right.
Anyway, I actually, the first really important job I had in the big world was with the New York Times, believe it or not. I was campus correspondent in my freshman year from Dickinson College, and then for 3 years from the University of Wisconsin. In those days, the campus correspondents were very important. It's worth noting that Abe Rosenthal was a campus correspondent. I think Max was a campus correspondent from Columbia. And there are quite a few other campus correspondents around. Abe Raskin was a campus correspondent. And I was a campus correspondent. They used to bring us in every year. So I cared a lot about the Times. It was a big thing. We didn't get bylines, I have to tell you,
though. Did you get money?
We got money. And we also got the honor of meeting storied characters from the Times in those days. This was in the 30s. So I mean, my first piece for the Time ran something like 60 years ago. But they would bring us in, and we would meet people like John Kieran, who was the famous sports columnist, and the editor of the editorial page then, who was Dr. John Finley. Even then, the Times had, academic respect, or whatever you call it, and they liked people with doctorates. They weren't very many, but there were some. But I always remember what John Kieran said, big influence in my life. We had this small group of campus correspondents around him, and John Kieran said, there's one firm rule I want you to have. He said, when you write something really brilliant, really good, he said, I want you to take a blue pencil and cross it out.
What? And then?
Well, that was the old Times approach to things. But actually, he was talking stylistically.
Now editors do that.
You shouldn't show off, and your more brilliant things were likely to be purple or, purple people eaters, stoppers of the reader, things like that. He was very smart. He was on Information Please. Well, galloping through the years to Business Week, in '54, it was the midst of the McCarthy era. And I had had a meteoric rise in Paris in the mission because all my bosses were getting fired, and none of them for legitimate reasons. Most of them turned out to have lives after this. But somebody would find a letter giving $2 to Black Mountain College, a front organization, and all that. So I was in charge of all the country desks, but nervous because
You were in charge in what way? You were a
well,
journalist?
no,
Right?
no, no,
this
no,
is
no.
pure- this is
I was an
something else.
economist. This
Okay,
was,
okay.
I was assistant commissioner in charge of the country desks, meaning analysis of the economies. And on the boat coming home for home leave, I had a cable from Elliott Bell saying, I would like to see you when you get to New York, because my friend Mel Pitzley, who was labor editor, said you ought to talk to him. So I went to see Bell, who had been at the New York Times, more New York Times history. He had done more or less what I was later to do. That is, he was the economics editorial writer, board member, as we used to fancily say, covering economics. And he had been in the news department. He covered the crash in '29. Well, anyway, he offered me a job right away. And I took it right away. So that was in November of '54. And then I stayed at Business Week for 15 years and hired you in 1961. There really wasn't anybody that was writing about economists. That's how I knew Leontiev, because I wrote a bit about Leontiev, and that's how I knew everybody. But there were people, including Bell, whom I just mentioned, who wrote about Wall Street or wrote about the country is going to the dogs, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But economics itself really wasn't covered.
And there was was there anyone else? You were a lone PhD economist writing about this area of intellectual knowledge, and that was a different thing. I think that was something that nobody was doing.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. You know, in the best times tradition, I would like to be exactly accurate. I can't guarantee that various people at Fortune or wherever, Gabe Hauge, who worked for Bell at Business Week, didn't write anything you could call economics ever, but there certainly was not an economics beat of covering developments in thought and theory and how it applied to the real world. Much later, Alan Greenspan got quoted as saying that I learned, he said, that all government policy starts in academia. Well, I like to think that I discovered that well before Greenspan, that various ideas, including John Maynard Keynes, you know, revolutionized economic policy, that started at the other Cambridge in England, at King's College, and the national income accounts all started in academia. The input-output stuff that Leontiev was responsible for there, monetarism with Friedman at Chicago, and so on, so that I was covering economics not just as news, although like the science stuff, it's news when something new happens, but because of its impact on the news, on the Fed, on the making of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and all the rest of it. So anyway, that was my entry.
Okay, was there a period in that time, in the 60s, 70s, when you were kind of coming from Business Week to here? I guess you came here in 70, so 60s and 70s. Was there a period, can you describe the progress of economics during that period as an important art form or, you know, policy influence at that time?
Yes. Well, I think that it was very important because the so-called Keynesian revolution reached government in a very explicit way at the start of the Kennedy administration. Walter Heller, whom I had known as a graduate student at Wisconsin. I was an undergraduate, but I used to play poker with Walter and Joe Peckman and those guys. Anyway, he became chairman of the council with Jim Tobin, who later got a Nobel Prize, Kermit Gordon, who was the head of Brookings, Bob Solow, who later got a Nobel Prize as a member of the staff only, Ken Arrow, who got a Nobel Prize, who was also a member of the staff. And it was a very learned council, and also very lively council, very nice guys as well as smart guys on the whole. And because I was close to Heller, I saw a lot of them. He used to have me come in and sit with the council and tell them what they were doing wrong from my perspective, that kind of thing. But at any rate, Heller started the campaign for the Kennedy tax cut that was supposed to happen in '63. He was assassinated in '63, and it wasn't put through until Johnson succeeded him after the assassination. The Kennedy-Johnson tax cut of 1964, Kennedy was already dead when it was passed, was a pure example of the way changes in economic theory led to a very important stroke of American fiscal policy. Now, you can say anybody can always cut taxes, but this was deliberately done to make the economy grow faster, to reduce unemployment, and it was sold that way. It's a lot easier to sell a tax cut than it is a tax increase, as we all know. And in fact, I would say that the high watermark of post-war economics and government was the Kennedy tax cut, followed by what was a turning point in the negative sense, a disastrous mistake, after the Vietnam War began to escalate, and after Johnson launched his Great Society programs, the government was slipping into deficit more and more. The country was overheating. Inflation was beginning to pick up. And people tried to prevail on Johnson, including his economic advisors, not publicly, privately, to raise taxes. Johnson put it off and put it off. And so did his Secretary of the Treasury, Joe Fowler, Henry J. Fowler, who was a friend. And I remember his saying to me, "Leonard, if you can convince me that Congress will support this, then we will go for it." And I said, "How can I convince you of that? I mean, it's your job. I mean, you know, talk to these people. They'll do it if you provide some leadership." But the administration did not. Johnson wanted to save his Great Society program. He didn't want to dramatize Vietnam. He was trying to tell people it would soon be over anyway. But that was the turning point also of our relatively non-inflationary post-war course. Inflation began to heat up. By present standards, it wasn't so high, 4.5%, but it was high enough. And the economists lost altitude. They had problems anyway in articulating policy. They began to be apologists for it. Anyway.
So they went from the highest moment, which was the tax cut, to a very low moment, which was
well, not the lowest. I mean, there were more low moments to come. You know?
Okay.
But at any rate, it was, I think, a turning point in post-war economic policy.
Okay, question. Was it difficult as they're close in with them, not their friend, but sort of their friend? You played the cards with them in college. Well, how hard was it for you to separate yourself from being one of them instead of one of us, journalists, you know? Or wasn't it?
Well, it didn't seem to me to be so hard. I suppose that by present, call it post-Watergate standards, I might have been too close, it's possible, but I certainly wasn't thereafter. And you know, it's a hard call for a journalist always. If you have people that you like, admire, respect, what are you supposed to do? Bitch them for the sheer sake of bitching them? Anyway, it really didn't come up, even in my consciousness, as a problem. There were always enough bad guys around, you know, to feel that you were doing your bit against the bad guys. And the good guys were quite good guys. As I was saying, Arthur Oken. Arthur was, you know, a peach of a guy. Died much too early, at age 50, roughly. But he was one of the most underappreciated economists to the outside world that I have known. He was marvelous. And they were also people of integrity. The problem in government, as I saw it, was not that these weren't decent people, but that the whole process of being an advisor to a president is itself a kind of corrupting thing. Either that, or it's just a tricky thing, because you've got to be loyal to a president, to your boss, to your administration, but you want to tell the truth, and it's a profession where you're only supposed to tell the truth, like journalism, as far as that goes. But, you know, nobody, at least not on the New York Times, makes us fake the evidence or fib or lie. But government is a corrupting institution. So are most special interests, and I treat government itself as a kind of special interest. Shouldn't be. During the Nixon administration, it didn't look so bad, but you know, Nixon had his great shocks, including price controls and his taking the dollar off gold and letting the dollar float, and also applying economic stimulus. All of this was for the sake of his re-election campaign.
Which was when? That was the summer of 71?
Yeah, it was in 70. He took office in 71. Is that right?
I think in 71 summer was the freeze. I know that.
Yeah, that's right.
So building up to that.
Yeah, building up in 71, with the campaign year was 71, and he was elected at the end of the year with the economy whizzing along. He had listened not to any of the economists as far as that goes. His economists were all against him. It was John Connally, the ex-governor of Texas, who was his Secretary of the Treasury and who had been a Democrat. And Nixon was enamored of John Connally as a big, strong, tough guy, and who knew how to do things, knew how to do them politically, and so on. But again, when all that was over, the economy was not left in very good shape. They began to decontrol, and prices rose and all that. But of course, the Watergate stuff blotted out whatever the consequences would have been. I wouldn't go as far as some people in blaming Nixon for the economic policy changes. I think they had long-lasting effects, and I think they helped to create the conditions for the oil price explosion that came along in the 70s. But at any rate, it was an ingenious policy. He was a very smart guy, including on economic policy as well as on foreign policy. But I felt that he was a politically irresponsible guy, or politically entirely narrowly motivated, focused guy.
How would you assess one of his, Arthur Burns, who was, I guess, the head of the Fed?
Yes.
During the Nixon appointed him, right?
Right.
Okay. Why don't we
well,
deal with him
Burns
for-
was first a counselor to Nixon, and then Nixon made him chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. I had a lot of respect for Arthur. Part of it, again, goes back to this business of being close to your sources. I had not been very close to Arthur, and he made the smart PR move, or whatever you call it, press management move, of inviting me up to his farm in Vermont. All the National Bureau people used to hang out there in Vermont, close to each other.
Wasn't it?
In Ely, Vermont, is right. And we spent a long weekend together talking about everything under the sun. And, you know, all that access, all that talk, it was hard not to like Arthur. But he was very much, you know, an agent or whatever for Nixon. And he also helped to put the economy in an upward spiral for the sake of the election. He was blasted by much of the press, including me, for doing that. But, you know, he sort of survived the criticism, and I still think he was a smart and canny guy. He later became ambassador to Germany, and the Germans, despite all of his carelessness with economic policy, greatly respected him as a person. He was really a terrific man in many ways. I have to tell you one thing that also endeared me to him slightly. He painted my wife's house. He grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, practically next door to my wife's family. His father was a house painter, and Arthur too was a house painter. And once in an interview, I said, "Arthur, do you realize that you painted my wife's house?" And he said, "Oh yes, I was always interested as a young man in the arts and crafts." And Arthur had got very stuffy and all that by the time he was a great Federal Reserve chairman, Columbia dean.
Let's talk about professionalism in journalism for a second.
All right.
I mean, you are, being a PhD economist, and you have to deal with that in some ways as you do your journalism.
Yes.
Is it a plus? Is it a minus? Is it a struggle sometimes? What?
Well, my answer is it really depends so much on the individual person who is a professional. And some professions probably spoil people less than other professions do, or vice versa. Some spoil them more. Now, for example, nobody would wonder very much about a lawyer, despite the reputation of lawyers, becoming a newspaper man. We've had lawyers on the paper, and you don't go around saying he's a lawyer.
And hide it, though.
We've had at least one doctor, Larry Altman. I'm sure we've had physicists or people who should have had doctorates in physics, whether they did or they didn't, like Bill Lawrence and Valdemar Kempfert and these other guys. They were the people that created Science News, and they were very serious about science. So there was the full equivalent. But economics, another thing. And I like to think that because I was either lucky in my teachers of economics, including at Wisconsin, including at Duke, it was a much more humanistic and institutional background than the abstractions of modern economics. Part of my good fortune, as I was saying, was that I had teachers who believed that people mattered and human institutions mattered. Economics has become, in academia, increasingly abstract, more and more mathematical, more and more symbolic, and that's all right, excepting that's not the way it is in the real world. It does matter what kind of a personality Arthur Burns has, or Alan Greenspan has, or the president has, or what his political problems are, and what the problems of institutions are, business institutions, banking institutions, S&Ls. All that feeds into the thing that newspapers cover. So I think that that was one good fortune that I had. The Chinese adventure was a great deal of fun, and it was at the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's regime, and we got to meet Deng Xiaoping. The thing that I remember most about him was how little he was, practically a midget, but very strong. Anyway, on the journalistic front, I've always enjoyed reporting enormously, and one of the most fun times I had was in Soviet Union. While it was still the Soviet Union, Andropov was the general secretary of the Communist Party, and our correspondent in Moscow was John Burns. And John, not all foreign correspondents do this, but you have to love the ones that do. He took care of me and took care of Bernice, my wife, who was traveling with me, and we had adventures in the markets where people tried to arrest us and tried to take away our cameras and our notebooks, and we had troubles all over the place. But then John put us on our own. We traveled Aeroflot, and I remember being down in Novosibirsk, where the head of the Novosibirsk Institute of Science was the presiding character at a table of all of these Soviet eggheads. It was a time when change was really beginning to happen, and I was suddenly inspired to say to them, well, if you're making all of these changes, what about Solzhenitsyn? What about, the great physicist? Sakharov. Are you going to reinstate him? And the head of the institute said, certainly not. He was a traitor, and so on and so on. And I said, what do you mean a traitor? He's an absolutely loyal citizen of this country who got a Nobel Prize. Do you think they give Nobel Prizes for being traitors? What's the matter with you? You can't talk like that. These are intelligent people. I completely lost control of myself. Bernice said it was my finest hour. They didn't do anything to me. But they did do something to me. We got back to Moscow after being on the road all the way out to Yakutsk. Got back to Moscow. They'd given us a new apartment at the National Hotel. They gave us the Lenin Suite, as they called it, with a great big grand piano for Bernice, who's a musician. So somebody must have thought nicely of that of that performance. Well, I guess all this illustrates that I think that, you know, the ideal used to be that a newspaper man was a kind of a recording machine or a camera. I am a camera. But none of us is. I mean, you know, we're people. And I always told people, I got my share of scoops over a long time. But people would say, how do you get these? And my answer is always, have trading material. Tell them things they don't know. I mean, that does not only put them under some need to tell you what they do know, but it means that you frequently are telling them things that you only partly know and you get the rest of. So, I mean, there's no antiseptic way to be a good reporter. You know this, Selma. And that goes for personalities and affections and so on. That's why I find it very hard to draw this line between having friends and not having friends. It's what you write that matters. It's not how you get it that matters. And it's your integrity that matters. You know, there's been this big debate this last couple of weeks about Janet Malcolm, in which she accuses the press of being con men, con women. She's a con woman. There's some truth in that. You know, we don't have powers of subpoena. We can't put people in jail. By some combination of charm, knowledge, asking the right question at the right time, having connections and so on, you get the news. And if you look at our best reporters, young ones like Bob Pear, or old ones like Abe Raskin or whatever, you know the people you're dealing with, you read the documents, you read everything, but you think and you know. And that's what our business is. And as I say, it can't be done antiseptically. Somebody can always say he got too close or he never was close enough to know what was going on. Well, of course you can get too close. My favorite quote is from an ancient Greek. I forget which Greek. No, it's not a Greek. It was from Machiavelli. Machiavelli talks about how close should you be to a prince if you are a writer. And he says it's like, how close should you sleep from a fire? Not so close that you get burned up, and not so far away that you'd freeze to death. Well, I think that, again, is the journalistic art. And you have to be close enough so you get what you need, not so close so you become co-opted, not so far away you never find out anything.
That's very nice. Good thing to cling to.
Yeah.
Talk about, you've talked about a couple of colleagues that you admired. I mean, you mentioned John Burns. You've mentioned others. But talk about a few journalists here at the Times that you worked around or with in your generation.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned Oakes, and I've mentioned Raskin and Fred Heckinger, and all my colleagues on the editorial board I thought were very good. In the news department of the paper, again, there are lots and lots of people.
Well, your roommate.
Well, Drew Middleton and I roomed together. When we both became over the hill, we were assigned an office together, and Drew and I got along extremely well until he was getting ill from a heart attack and all that kind of thing. Drew is a good example of this business of professionalism. Again, I don't know what rank Drew held ever in his life. I'm not even sure he ever actually had military service. Unlike Hanson Baldwin, who's a good example, who went to Annapolis and whose office I got when I moved into the editorial board. He had just retired. But at any rate, whether he had rank or not, Drew was an absolute professional, and the military trusted him. Again, Drew was occasionally criticized because he was too close to the military, that kind of thing. That's always the problem you have. You're either too close or too far away. But at any rate, Drew produced stories. I mean, he could cover, as he did, the war in the Falklands from London, where he happened to be, better than anybody could cover it from the Falklands or from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, because he knew everybody. He knew all the generals, he knew the admirals, he knew the queen, the king, he had the clubs, and he wrote brilliantly about the war in the Malvinas. Anyway, he also produced every day. I mean, you practically had to sit on Drew to keep him from writing a piece. Now, that wasn't true of his successor, a famous lieutenant general, whose name slips my mind at the moment, since he probably had 5 stories in the paper the whole 2 years, whatever it was he was here. But that's why I say you've got to be a professional, but you've got to be a newspaperman, too, or a newspaper woman. And in this day and age, I don't say that formally, the Times has always had some excellent people, including Ada Louise, who was on the editorial board and was a great critic before that of architecture and a great critic after she retired. She could be a pain in the neck in some ways, but that was because she was ahead of her time, too. In those days, women were not supposed to be a pain in the neck, and Ada Louise was a pain in the neck. I think Charlotte Curtis could be a pain in the neck, and she was a terrific editor. And she was really the founding editor of the op-ed page. Actually, Harrison Salisbury says he was the founding editor, but I think that Charlotte was the founding editor, in my recollection. Well, actually, it was Harrison, but the page really took off under Charlotte. And I think it was a very important contribution. All of these characters come into conflict with each other on important issues. The founding of the op-ed page, which was really the first of any in the country, now everybody's got one, was an internal brawl at the New York Times for about 6 years, with people having different philosophies of what it should be. The Oaks philosophy was that it should be physically opposite the editorial page. The Rosenthal concept would be that it should correct the sins of the editorial page, opposite in that sense, and a forum for everybody who disagreed. Well, anyway, there were these differences and reconciliations. I don't know how anybody perceives it today. It's sometimes op, it's sometimes non-op, supportive.
I'd like to hear what you have to say about a man named Abe Rosenthal, who ran this place for a long time during your occupation.
Well, it's very difficult to say anything simple about Abe. He's such a complicated person and such a mixture of brilliance, insight, contrariness, uncertainty, and areas of ignorance. You know, you sort of get the real Abe out of his column, most of which I don't think very much of, but occasionally would show flashes of real brilliance, of what matters in the world. He certainly has a lot of guts. I don't think anybody can question Abe's courage. The question is really one of getting him pointed in the right direction. I feel bad, for example, still over this whole Ray Bonner affair. I happen to think that the version that Abe has given the story of, he was just improving Bonner's education, that he had never had the experience of covering a place like Salvador and murders and things like that, which he did with great honor, that to say that he'd never served on the Metro desk and then was sent immediately to Biz Fin and so on, that's not a very ingenuous. Is ingenuous a real word, or is it just disingenuous? It is a disingenuous. It is not an ingenuous explanation of what happened there. I think that Abe was attracted by the right wing, that in trying to move the paper to the center, as he put it, he was moving it to the right from what he conceived to be the left. You know, it's so hard in this world to define what's left, what's right, what's center. But humanitarianism is left. Hard-nosedness and cruelty is presumably right. accepting that that doesn't correspond to the real world. Stalin was left and was as cruel a bastard as ever lived. Somebody else maybe is a conservative, but that doesn't make him hard-nosed or willing to submit people to murder or torture, whatever. Anyway, Abe's made his mistakes, but I think as an editor, he deserves great credit for bringing the Times into the modern age. Incidentally, he and the publisher deserve most credit for Pentagon Papers and for being willing to stand up to fight the administration on it. Even Johnny Oakes, my admired, beloved friend, thought we should only write excerpts from it, summarize the papers. John had been OSS and was very sensitive to codes and ciphers and top secrets and all that, and was really much more careful than Punch was or than Abe was about Pentagon Papers. I think that if I can wrap up Abe, he was a human, is a human being with a lot of heart, which sometimes gets, again, misaimed. But he was wonderful to my son Andy, for example. It was he that suggested to Andy write the final piece about his cancer, stuck it on the cover of the Times magazine. You know, how can I hate anybody that ever did anything like that? You know, I'm capable of being very mad at Abe and critical of Abe, but I think that in his own way, he's a newspaper genius with more insight than information.
Let's shift. How about Punch? Your relationship with Punch over the years?
Well, I've learned from Punch, and I don't know if I ever taught Punch anything, but I remember, just to take a learning experience, once I had written an editorial that was highly critical of Eisenhower because Eisenhower had yielded to pressure over an interest lobby that turned him around on class action suits. And the piece said essentially that this is just yielding to pressure. Anyway, Punch said to me, "What do you mean it's yielding to pressure? How do you know? Did you sleep with him? Is this pillow talk? Where did you get this?" I said, "Perfectly obvious. This group came in, they talked to him, he changed his position." He said, "That doesn't make it information. You don't know that. That's attributing something to him. Just stay with what the facts are." Well, I never forgot that. We should be very, very careful when we attribute motives to people or causes. If you really know, fine, but don't get it out of somebody else's story. I mean, there are ways of telling the truth very carefully, and I think that Punch was careful that way. I don't think he liked the voice of the paper to be a noisy voice. I think he much preferred it to be a quiet, persuasive voice, the way his grandfather preferred it to be. No, not his grandfather, it is his grandfather, that's right, you forget how much time has gone by. Anyway, that's right, it was his grandfather, Adolf, who used to quote, I quote this in my chapter, how Iphigene learned the lesson from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And in the Franklin autobiography, there's a passage which says, persuade people to your positions. Don't be too argumentative or authoritative, and so on. And that was on page 99 of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And when Iphigene got out of line, when she was a feisty young social worker out of Barnard, Adolf would say to her, "Page 99, Iphigene." Well, anyway, I think that Punch grew up with that kind of background, instruction, and so on. I'm saying this now very strongly to Punch's credit, that I think the traditions of the paper mean an enormous amount to him, that they really were, as his grandfather said, a kind of a public trust. Now, sometimes that made him hypersensitive to criticism. I can cite one example. The canning of Abe Raskin, also devoted to the New York Times, Abe had been labor editor in the days when there was age 65 retirement rules.
Mm-hmm.
He was not retired. He was moved down to the 3rd floor to write a labor column. And after 1 year, the column was suspended because Abe had been critical of the changes in the editorial board when Max succeeded Johnny. Anyway, Abe used his retirement party as the occasion for saying we must never forget the highest principles of the Times, its integrity, and he included in that publisher interference in people's convictions. Well, whether he should have said it is another matter, but he did say it. And the fact is, Punch was very upset because it was, I think he was upset for the best kind of reasons, whether Abe realized it or not, because he was questioning the publisher's commitment to the honor of the paper, the integrity of the paper, the importance of not pushing people around, that kind of thing. And so it was a kind of mistake on Abe's part, but it was a mistake with only the best intentions of fighting for the integrity of the editorial board, not to make it subservient to the opinions, even of the publisher. Anyway, these are the kinds of things that one remembers. So I don't know, it may be that Punch sometimes been too thin-skinned, and sometimes maybe even too loyal to people. I don't know. I think anybody that is loyal to him, he's extremely loyal to. And he often would ask you to do something. I mean, the one time I can remember when the editorial board changed, John Oakes was leaving, and I felt that I ought to resign too. And Punch sat me down with him and said, I don't want you to do that. I want you to stay where you are. He said, I would regard it as a personal favor, he said to me, if you would stay where you are. I said, if you put it that way, how can I do anything else? I said, but I would like to write the column twice a week. That was how it changed. Well, when Max heard about that, he said, well, if he really wants to write the column, it's all right with me. Like, oh, you know. So I left the editorial board soon afterward, and that's the way it happened. Well, in a nutshell, we're a human institution. We've got people who care enormously, I won't say more than they should, enormously, about what happens at the paper, about what gets into the paper, and about its principles, and as well as the fact that things have got to be accurate and have got to be honest. I think that's the greatness of the New York Times, that we are really dedicated to that, that nobody would knowingly change it. They might unconsciously interfere with it, make a mistake. I've criticized Abe over Bonner and the murder of these dozens and dozens of people. I forget how many, like 100 people were massacred. Their bones have just been found, a terrible thing. But I'm sure it wasn't done knowingly for ideological reasons. They're just human beings make mistakes. We make mistakes. I never made one, if you're going to ask me that.
I'm not going to ask you that. That's the last question. No. Talking about the tone of the editorial page and tone of the Times has to bring up what's going on now a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, the editorial page is undergoing some sort of changes with Howell.
Right.
And the paper itself.
Well, it's been cyclical. Speaking about the editorial page, Johnny Oakes's page used to get criticized as being too shrill, as being strident. He hated that criticism. It was strong. Max toned it down, and Jack toned it down. I had said that the editorial page under Oakes was criticized as strident. It was a term he hated. What he liked was for it to not say, on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm quoting John directly, that was the one thing he was determined would never be on the page. But he felt that the Times should take stronger positions. The history of the Times editorial page was a rather soft editorial page, reflective, if you want to give a kinder word, but that it was not really very decisive. I don't know whether it lost anything very much under Max and under Jack, but I don't think it had the same kind of dedication that it had under John, in particular about the environment, but even more than that, on moral values. John is a moral person, ran a very moral page. Now, I think that with Howell, we're seeing a return to stridency, if you want to insult it. I wouldn't use the term. I think it's a page which is showing strength, zeal, moral fervor, a capacity for anger, and that it's nonpartisan. It's about as mean to Clinton as it is to Bob Dole. Maybe it's slightly meaner to Dole and the Republicans. But at any rate, I think that it probably does reflect what Arthur wants more than Punch's general approach to life. And you can argue these things either way. You know, it is meaningless for me to say which I really prefer, but I will say it. I really prefer the Howell-John approach to it, because I think if you've got an editorial page, it should be prepared, not every time, but once in a while, to punch somebody in the nose, even to knock somebody's teeth out, because the country needs it. That's what the press is for. You're not just supposed to be a gentle amusement for people out there. You're supposed to be a voice. So I think that the heroic moments for the press in my time include Watergate, include Pentagon Papers, we should have beat up harder on Reagan. That's an act of omission. Earlier, I was talking about the great economic mistakes. I think Reaganism was an utter disaster for this country. The debt, the foreign debt position, the slowing of growth, the weakening of our corporate structure in the name of freeing them, deregulation. They allowed antitrust to go into atrophy, and a lot of terrible things happened in the Reagan-Bush years, and we're still hoping to get out of it now, and we're worrying about Clinton that he doesn't have enough guts to do what needs to be done, or he doesn't have enough leadership or knowledge or talent or something. To be objective about it, the lifting of the national debt from less than $1 trillion when he took office to $4 trillion when he left office, and still rising. It wasn't quite up to 4 then. Bush continued the kind of policies Reagan had, and his one feeble attempt to do something about the deficit cost him the election, having said, read my lips, no tax increases, and then he tried to do something on the tax front. But at any rate, I think that that whole array of things really has hurt the country a lot. Now, fortunately, we're a strong country. We have strong institutions, including the press and so on, and our science and technology and the university world, and some at least of our business. We will survive this era. But I think we have been hurt. The economists I also blame for some of this. Of course, it wasn't even real economists that created the whole supply-side economics. It were publicists like Jude Wanniski and Art Laffer, who has a PhD from Chicago. The monetarists hurt a great deal, too. By following strict rules, they really got us in trouble in 81, 82. The explosion of debt after that was an effort to replace banks which had been supervised. The S&L crisis was a disaster, as far as I'm concerned, of monetarism. I think a lot of things went wrong, and the stock market crashed. Fortunately, the Fed by then had got back to being pragmatic, with Greenspan having unlearned his rigid monetarism and unlearned his Ayn Randism on government should be exported, and we don't need a government, and so on. Anyway, my personal regrets are that I just didn't do a better job. You know, I would like to have done everything. Have written more, written better, done it all, have changed the country, saved it from mortal error, and so on. There's never enough time to do it all. But I think that Jefferson was right about the importance of the press, and he said it even more important than government if you have to get rid of one or the other. Well, you can't get rid of either one. But I think a good society needs freedom, needs a free press, as its exemplar, leader, so on. Punch never thought we should be a leader, excepting indirectly. In that one memorable interview that I used for the chapter in the book called The American Establishment, I say to him, do you think that the Times should be a leader? His first response was, well, no. And then he said, we should just, you know, cover the news, and if we cover it right, and if we think right, then we will be a leader. But that was a kind of a qualification. I don't think he really felt, I don't know how he feels today, that the Times should be a crusading institution. It should be a reflecting, observing, reporting medium, not a powerful leader. Well, that's a philosophy. It happens not to be mine. I mean, there's a very strong case to be made for it in the news columns, but I think the editorial voice should be a strong voice. Now, it's hard to keep them totally separate, although that's what church and state is all about. It wasn't about the business side. It was about the separation of news and editorial, and I'm all for that. But even there, it's difficult, because the selection of news depends on your conviction about what's important. Either a murder's important or it isn't important. Either Watergate's important or it isn't important. Either the coverage of the Vietnam War is important or it isn't. And you can't do it perfectly. We are sensitive, intelligent human beings, and we care about things. You do it honestly. There's a big difference between honesty and objectivity. Objectivity is sort of neutered, like a pussycat that can't have babies. But honesty can have babies, can do anything it wants to do. It has principles as well as integrity. And my philosophy of newspapering and the Times is that we should have honesty and integrity, and you hope for objectivity so that even your enemies say, well, they did get it right, the sons of bitches.